The morning her mother told her she was not worth dressing properly, Mina Ellery had already learned not to cry in front of the mirror. She stood in the narrow light of the breakfast room at Hartwell Cottage, watching her sister Seraphina turn slowly before their mother's approving eyes, the new rose-colored gown catching the candlelight like something out of a painting. No one turned to look at Mina. No one needed to. She had long ago become the sort of daughter people looked past, the useful one, the plain one, the one who mended hymns and answered correspondence, and was trusted to keep her opinions to herself. "You will wear the grey," her mother said to her, not unkindly, simply as one states an obvious fact. "It is serviceable, and no one will remark upon it either way. No one will remark upon it." Mina had heard variations of that sentence her whole life, and she had trained herself to receive it the way one receives weather, without argument, because arguing with weather changes nothing. They were bound for Wrenfield Hall within the week. Invited. Seraphina invited. Truly. With Mina brought along only because a young lady of quality could not travel to a duke's house party without a sister or companion to lend her countenance. Mina was not going to be seen. She was going to be useful. She understood the distinction perfectly, and some small, stubborn part of her still ached at it, though she had promised herself years ago that she would stop expecting otherwise. What she did not know, what no one in that breakfast room could have guessed, was that within a fortnight, a duke reputed to be as cold and unreadable as the stone of his own hall would place a plain gold pocket watch into her hands and, without a single word of explanation, use it to measure the whole of her character. She did not know yet that he was watching already, in a manner of speaking, before she had even set foot upon his land. Word had reached Wrenfield of the Ellery family's straitened circumstances, of the debts quietly owed, of a mother eager to marry off a beautiful daughter to anyone with a title. Julian Hale, Duke of Wrenfield, had learned to read such letters of introduction the way other men read ledgers, for what they concealed, not what they declared. He had learned that lesson at great cost. 3 years earlier, a woman named Cassandra Ray had knelt before him in this very hall, weeping with what he had believed, foolishly, entirely, was love, only to be discovered a fortnight after their betrothal negotiating a settlement with his own solicitor behind his back, securing terms for herself should the marriage falter, as though he were an asset to be hedged against, rather than a man to be trusted. His mother, dying slowly of a wasting illness that autumn, had gripped his hand and made him promise something strange. Something he had turned over in his mind every day since. "Do not choose a bride by her beauty, Julian, nor by her name, nor by what she says to you in company," she had whispered. "Choose her by what she does when she believes no one is watching. That is the only truth in this world that cannot be performed." And so, in the years since, Julian Hale had developed what his household staff called, with equal parts affection and unease, his little tests. A dropped glove left in a hallway, a misdirected letter set upon a hall table, its seal loose enough to open without effort, and, most often, his late mother's pocket watch, gold, engraved, worn smooth at the edges from her own thumb, left seemingly forgotten in places his guests were likely to pass. He watched, quietly, who returned such things without being asked, and who did not return them at all. It had become, in 3 years, a rather lonely sort of ritual. No one had ever surprised him. He did not expect the plain sister of a fortune-seeking family to be the one who finally did. The carriage ride to Wrenfield took the better part of 2 days, and by the time the towers of the great house rose grey and formidable against the autumn sky, Mina's back ached from the road, and her mother's voice ached in her ears from 2 days of rehearsing exactly how Seraphina ought to comport herself before a duke. Not one word had been spent on how Mina ought to comport herself, because it had simply been assumed there was nothing worth managing. "You will keep to the edges of the rooms," her mother instructed as the carriage rattled over the final rise. "You will not draw attention. If anyone speaks to you, you will be brief and pleasant, and steer the conversation toward your sister at the very first opportunity." "Yes, mother," Mina said, because it was easier than the alternative, and because some quiet, wounded corner of her had stopped expecting anything else so long ago that the instruction no longer even stung the way it once had. Almost Wrenfield Hall, when it finally came into full view, took her breath entirely, not with grandeur alone, though it possessed that in abundance, its long stone fade catching amber light, its windows glinting like 100 watching eyes, but with a kind of unexpected melancholy that seemed to rise from the very stones. It did not look like a house that held parties easily. It looked like a house that was waiting for something. She did not know yet that the house was waiting for her. The first days passed as Mina had expected them to. She was introduced, briefly, to the Duke of Wrenfield in the receiving line, and given precisely the courtesy owed to any guest, and not a syllable more. He was taller than she had imagined, dark-haired, with a composure so complete it read almost as indifference, and eyes the color of rain-soaked slate that moved over the assembled guests without lingering on anyone in particular, until, for 1/2 of 1 second, they lingered on her and then moved on so swiftly she decided she had imagined it. Serafina, meanwhile, bloomed in every room she entered. She laughed at exactly the correct moments. She admired the gallery of ancestral portraits with exactly the correct degree of awe. She positioned herself, evening after evening, precisely where the candlelight would be kindest to her. And their mother watched with the fierce, calculating satisfaction of a woman who believed the campaign was going exactly to plan. No one watched Mina at all, which was, she told herself firmly on the 3rd evening, walking the cold garden paths alone while the drawing-room laughed without her, precisely how she preferred it. She was wrong about that, though she would not learn how wrong for some time yet. It happened on the 4th morning in the orangery, where Mina had gone to escape a breakfast conversation that revolved, as it so often did, around calculating the precise value of the Duke's estate against the precise deficiencies of her family's own. She had walked the glass-paned length of the orangery twice, breathing in the green, damp quiet of it, when her slipper caught against something small and hard beneath a fern. She knelt. It was a pocket watch, gold, heavier than it looked, its case worn smooth along one edge, as though it had been carried and turned over in someone's palm for years beyond counting. She turned it gently and found an inscription on the inner case, worn but legible, to measure what matters, not merely what passes. Her breath caught. It was not the sort of thing one simply misplaced and forgot. Someone would be grieving its loss at this very moment. She could have kept it. The thought arrived, unbidden and immediately unwelcome, though she noted with some discomfort that it had arrived at all. A watch of this quality would fetch enough to settle a portion of her father's smaller debts, enough to buy Serafina the gloves and slippers their mother fretted over nightly. Enough, perhaps, to be useful in the one way Mina had always been permitted to be useful. No one had seen her find it. No one would ever know. She closed her hand around it, and something in her chest, some old, tired, stubborn thing that had survived every small humiliation of her life intact, refused the thought outright. It was not hers. That fact settled the matter entirely, and she did not allow herself to weigh it further. She carried it directly to the housekeeper, a stern, silver-haired woman named Mrs. Price, who received the watch with an expression Mina could not quite read, something between surprise and a very old, very private amusement. "You found this where, miss?" "Beneath the fern by the south wall." I did not open it beyond reading the inscription, to see whose it might be, but there was no name. Mrs. Price turned the watch over once in her weathered hand. "And you brought it straight to me. Where else would I bring it?" "Some might have kept it, miss. It is worth a great deal." Mina felt heat rise unbidden to her cheeks, some old wound flaring at the implication, however gently offered. "It is not mine to keep, merely because I found it unguarded." Something shifted in the housekeeper's face then. A softening so brief Mina nearly missed it. "No, Mrs." Price agreed quietly. "It is not." And she said nothing further, only tucked the watch into her apron pocket and thanked Mina with a courtesy that felt, somehow, weightier than the words themselves. Mina did not think of the matter again that day. She had no reason to suspect that within the hour, Mrs. Price had carried the watch not to some anonymous lost and found drawer, but directly to the Duke's private study, and set it upon his desk with the single sentence that would occupy his thoughts for the remainder of the house party. The Ellery sister found it. "Your Grace." The quiet one brought it straight to me and never once asked who it belonged to, nor what reward there might be in it. Julian Hale sat very still for a long moment, looking at his mother's watch resting once more upon his desk, and felt something in his carefully guarded chest shift, quietly, like a door easing open after years of disuse. He had left the watch in 6 different places over 3 house parties in as many years. He had watched it be ignored, or pocketed and never returned, or once, memorably, presented to him with such theatrical fanfare by a hopeful young lady that he had understood immediately she had been informed of its significance by a servant she'd bribed. Never, in 3 years, had it simply been returned, quietly, completely, without a single question asked about its worth to the finder. He found himself, for the first time since his mother's death, curious about a guest in his own house, and unsettled by how much that curiosity troubled him. He did not seek Mina out directly. That was not his way, and besides, some cautious, well-worn part of him distrusted the very interest he felt. As though it might yet prove another performance he had simply failed, this time, to detect. Instead, he watched. He watched her at dinner, seated near the foot of the table where the family's diminished consequence placed her, and noticed she listened more than she spoke, and that when she did speak, it was to draw out the quiet elderly aunt beside her, rather than to angle for his own attention, as every other unmarried lady at that table seemed constantly, exhaustingly engaged in doing. He watched her in the library 2 evenings later, when she believed the room empty, running her fingers along the spines of books she was clearly not permitted to linger over, murmuring the titles to herself with an unguarded delight that vanished the instant she heard the door, replaced immediately by the careful, unremarkable blankness she seemed to wear for company, like a second gown. He introduced himself to her there, that evening, not as the Duke of Wrenfield, a small, deliberate omission he told himself was merely convenient, though later he would admit it had been something closer to cowardice, or perhaps to hope, but simply as Julian. "Forgive me," she said, startled, already retreating toward the door. "I did not think anyone—" "You are fond of Mallory," he said, nodding to the volume still open in her hands, and watched surprise chase the wariness from her face. "I did not expect anyone in this house to know it," she admitted, and then, catching herself, added more carefully, "I did not mean to give offense. None taken. It is a fine thing. To find someone in a house full of dancing who would rather be lost in Camelot." She studied him a moment, not with the calculating assessment he had grown so weary of receiving from young ladies measuring his coat and his bearing against his rumoured income, but with a kind of open curiosity that felt, absurdly, like being truly looked at for the first time in years. "Are you one of the Duke's stewards, then?" she asked. "You have the look of someone who works rather than merely attends." He nearly laughed, a rare enough occurrence that it startled even himself. "Something of the sort," he said, and let the ambiguity stand, and told himself it was harmless. There was, in that first exchange, a small moment neither of them spoke of afterward, though both remembered it well. As she turned to replace the volume of Mallory upon its shelf, her sleeve caught the edge of a lower shelf, and a scatter of loose papers slipped free, drifting down between them. He knelt at once to help her gather them, and their hands met briefly over a single page, an old household accounting, nothing of any real consequence. And for the length of a single indrawn breath, neither moved to withdraw. It was Mina who broke the stillness first, murmuring an apology that neither of them quite believed was necessary, and rising rather too quickly, color high in her cheeks. Julian said nothing of it, though he found himself, long after she had gone, still holding the page she had touched, turning it over in his hands as though it might somehow explain to him why so small a thing had unsettled him so thoroughly. It was the beginning of a habit neither of them named. Over the following days, they found the library at the same quiet hour more than once, and Julian, who had not spoken freely to anyone in 3 years, who measured every sentence he offered in company for what it might reveal or conceal, found himself talking to Mina Ellery about books, about his mother, about the peculiar loneliness of a house too large for the people left inside it, with an ease that frightened him rather more than it ought to have. She, in turn, found herself telling him things she had never said aloud to anyone, how it felt to be the daughter no one expected anything from, how she had trained herself long ago to want very little, because wanting things that were never given to you was simply a slower, more private sort of grief. "You speak as though you have already decided your life will be small," he said one evening quietly, watching her over the low candlelight. "I have decided nothing," she answered. "I have simply learned what is likely. Those are not the same thing." She looked at him then with something that might have been the beginning of hope, quickly suppressed, as one suppresses a spark near dry, kindling for fear of what it might become. "No," she agreed softly. "But it is easier to live as though they were." He wanted, in that moment, to tell her precisely who he was, precisely why her honesty in a garden with a piece of gold had undone 3 years of careful, wounded distance in a matter of days. He did not. Some old caution held his tongue, some remnant of Cassandra Ray's betrayal that whispered, "Wait, watch a little longer, be certain." And so the moment passed, and the deception, however unintended in its origin, continued one day longer than it should have. It would cost them both dearly before the truth finally set them right. While Julian and Mina built their fragile, unspoken understanding in the hush of the library, another campaign was advancing rather more loudly through the rest of the house. Mrs. Ellery had noted, with the sharp instinct of a woman who had spent a decade calculating advantageous matches, that the Duke had begun seeking out the library at odd hours, and she had drawn, with characteristic confidence, entirely the wrong conclusion. "He reads in the evenings," she informed Serafina over their morning chocolate, with the triumphant air of a general who has located the enemy's weak flank. "You will develop, my dear, a sudden and passionate interest in poetry." Serafina, who had never in her life finished a book of poetry nor wished to, dutifully appeared in the library the following evening, gown arranged with careful artlessness, a slim volume of Byron open upon her lap, though her eyes rarely troubled the page. She found the Duke there, as promised, and Mina beside him, and something small and ugly tightened in her chest that she did not examine too closely. "Your Grace," Serafina said, with a smile calibrated precisely to charm, "I did not know you were fond of poetry. I find myself quite lost in it these days." Julian rose, courteous as ever, and gave her the correct degree of attention, no more, no less, and Mina, watching from her chair with the old familiar ache of a woman, accustomed to disappearing beside her sister's brightness, rose as well, murmuring some excuse about the lateness of the hour, and left the room before either of them could see her face. She did not weep. She had promised herself, that morning at the mirror so many years ago, that she would not weep over things that were never truly hers to lose, but the ache sat heavy in her chest all the same, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had allowed herself to hope that something, someone, was truly hers, and hope, once permitted even a little room to breathe, does not retreat quietly. Serafina, for her part, returned to their shared chamber later that night, flushed with satisfaction. "He is quite taken, I think," she told their mother, who received the news with a delight so complete it filled the small room like perfume. "Though he is a curious sort of man. Reserved, I believe it will take some patience to draw him out fully." Neither of them noticed Mina in the corner, folding linens with hands that had gone very still, saying nothing at all. That same night, unable to sleep, Mina slipped down to the darkened library one final time, telling herself she wished only to return a book left behind in her haste, though in truth she wished simply to sit a moment longer in the one room at Wrenfield that had ever felt, however briefly, like it belonged to her. She did not expect to find Julian still there, seated alone by the dying fire, a letter from his solicitor forgotten upon his knee. "I thought you had retired," he said, rising at once. "I only meant to return this," she said, holding up the book as though it were evidence of some crime, and immediately despised herself for the excuse. He studied her a moment in the low firelight, and something in his expression, careful, searching, made her chest ache with a longing she had no name yet safe enough to give it. "Your sister recited Byron rather beautifully this evening," he said at last, watching her closely. "She did," Mina agreed, keeping her voice light with an effort that cost her more than she wished to admit. "She has always had a gift for being admired. I confess I found myself listening for another voice entirely," Julian said quietly, and the words landed in the hushed room with a weight that startled them both. He seemed almost to regret them the instant they had left him, glancing away toward the fire as though he might retrieve them from the air. "Forgive me. That was not mine to say." "No," Mina said softly, and found she could not quite make herself sound as though she minded it. "But I am glad you said it all the same." They stood a moment longer in a silence that felt far more dangerous than any words might have been, and it was only the distant striking of the hall clock, marking the very late hour, that finally sent Mina hurrying from the room, with her heart beating far too quickly for a woman who had told herself, only that morning, that she wanted nothing at all from a man she believed to be nothing more than a steward. She did not yet understand how close they had come, in that quiet firelit room, to a confession neither of them was fully ready to survive. The days that followed grew harder to bear than any Mina had known at Wrenfield thus far. She avoided the library, telling herself it was foolishness to grieve a friendship, for that was surely all it had been. She insisted to herself, nothing more, built on a handful of quiet evenings and a shared fondness for old books. She busied herself instead with her aunt's correspondence and her mother's endless instructions, and told herself, with the same practiced discipline she had used her whole life, that this was simply how things were meant to go. Julian noticed her absence within a single evening, and found the library unbearably quiet without her in it. He told himself this too was foolishness, that a man in his position could not afford to measure his contentment by the presence of a penniless guest's overlooked sister, however honest she had proven with a piece of gold. But the study of ledgers held no interest for him that week, and the correspondence piling on his desk went curiously unanswered, and more than once he caught himself listening for a particular light step in the corridor that never came. It was his old friend and estate manager, Mr. Aldous Fenn, who finally said aloud what Julian had been avoiding admitting even to himself. "You've been a poor sort of company this week, Your Grace, if you'll forgive my saying so. I have a great deal on my mind." "You have a great deal on your mind that happens to have brown eyes and an aunt with excellent hearing," Fenn said dryly. "The whole staff has remarked it, Mrs. Price in particular. She's rather fond of the young lady who brought your mother's watch back without a second glance at its worth." Julian said nothing for a long moment, staring into the low fire of his study. "I have not told her who I am." Fenn's eyebrows rose considerably. "I see. It began as an accident of introduction. It has become something rather more deliberate. and I find I do not entirely know how to undo it without losing whatever it is we have built. You might simply tell her the truth, Your Grace. It has been known to work, on occasion. And if she looks at me afterward, the way every other woman in this house looks at me, as a title first, and a man second, if at all. Fenn studied his old friend with the patience of a man who had watched him grieve his mother, weather Cassandra Ray's betrayal, and slowly wall himself into a solitude that suited no one, least of all himself. Then you will have lost nothing you did not already fear losing, he said gently. But if you are wrong, if she is what 3 years of watches and gloves and misdirected letters have never once found you, then continuing to hide will cost you both something you may never recover. I should think that is the greater risk, Your Grace, though it is not my place to say so. Julian did not answer. But that night, for the first time in a week, he sent word through Mrs. Price that the library would be lit, should any guest care to visit it. Mina came. She told herself she came only for the books, and perhaps, in some small honest corner of herself, she nearly believed it. She found Julian waiting by the low fire, and something in his bearing, a certain careful weight to his stillness, told her before he spoke a single word that this evening would be different from all the others. I owe you an apology, he said, before she had even fully crossed the threshold, and a confession I ought to have offered a fortnight ago. Her pulse quickened, though she could not have said whether from hope or dread. The two had begun, in recent days, to feel disconcertingly alike. What confession? I am not a steward of this house, he said quietly. I am its master. I am Julian Hale, Duke of Wrenfield, and I have let you believe otherwise for reasons I am no longer entirely certain I can defend. The silence that followed felt enormous. Mina stood very still, feeling something in her chest that was neither quite anger nor quite grief, but some difficult, unfamiliar combination of both. A sense of ground shifting treacherously beneath feet she had thought, for once, stood on solid earth. You let me speak to you as though, she began, and stopped, and tried again. You let me tell you things I have never told anyone, about my family, about myself. And all the while you were watching. Yes, he said, and had the grace, at least, not to soften the word, though not in the manner I fear you are imagining. Let me explain, if you will permit it, before you judge me for a deception I did not fully intend to sustain so long. He told her then of his mother's dying wish, of the watch left deliberately in the orangery, of 3 years spent watching guests fail a small, quiet test of character time and again, and of the singular, startling fact that she alone, of everyone who had ever crossed that threshold, had returned it without a single question of reward. I did not seek you out afterward to deceive you, he said. I sought you out because I could not stop thinking of a woman who chose honesty when no one was watching, and I wished, selfishly perhaps, to know her a little longer before the whole weight of my title changed the way she looked at me. I told myself I would explain everything within a day or two. The days became a fortnight, and each evening I found a new reason to delay. Because I feared. I still fear that the moment you know what I am, you will stop seeing who I am. Mina felt tears rise, unbidden and unwelcome, and fought them with the same discipline she had spent a lifetime perfecting. You tested me, she said, low and unsteady, like a wager, like a puzzle to be solved. I did not set out to test you that morning in the orangery. I have set such tests for others, yes, out of a wound I am not proud of. But what grew between us afterward was never a test, Mina. It was the first honest thing I have permitted myself in 3 years, and I was too great a coward to risk losing it by telling you the truth the moment I understood how much it had already come to matter. She turned from him, needing a moment to breathe, to gather the scattered, painful pieces of what she had believed these past days into something she could hold steady. Somewhere beneath the hurt, She recognized the shape of something achingly familiar. The particular grief of discovering that even a rare, precious thing had arrived, wrapped in a lie, however gently intended. "I need time," she said finally, quietly. "I cannot simply set this aside, because your reasons were kind ones. Kindness does not undo deception, Your Grace." The title, spoken deliberately, landed between them like a closed door. Julian bowed his head, accepting it. "Then I will give you whatever time you require," he said. "But I will not stop hoping you find your way back to calling me Julian before this house party ends." She left the library that night with her heart in some difficult, unresolved place between fury and longing, and did not return to it for 3 days. Those 3 days proved eventful in ways neither Mina nor Julian could have foreseen. Mrs. Ellery, sensing something had shifted though not understanding its true nature, redoubled her efforts on Serafina's behalf with the fervor of a woman who feared her one great opportunity slipping away. She contrived a private conversation between the Duke and her elder daughter in the rose garden, engineered a seating arrangement at dinner that placed them scandalously close, and, on the third evening, orchestrated what she believed would be the crowning triumph of her campaign, a small gathering in the drawing room at which Serafina would perform upon the pianoforte, an accomplishment she had been drilled in relentlessly for exactly this purpose. The drawing room that evening had been arranged with particular care, the candles lit lower than usual to flatter the pianoforte's polished wood, the guests seated in a loose half-circle that left Serafina, and by extension the whole of the Ellery family's carefully managed prospects, at the very center of the room's attention. Mina had taken a seat near the window, half in shadow, and found herself, despite everything, hoping quietly that her sister's performance would go well. For whatever complicated feelings sat between them, she had never once wished Serafina harm, only wished, in her own private way, to be permitted to exist beside her rather than always behind her. Julian sat near the fire, his expression courteous and unreadable, and Mina caught herself watching him rather more than she watched her sister's hands upon the keys, cataloguing every small shift of his attention with a hunger she was not yet ready to name even to herself. It was during this very performance that the second great reversal of the house party arrived, delivered not by Julian nor by Mina, but by Miss Delacourt, a sharp-tongued young lady of considerable fortune and considerably sharper ambition, who had arrived at Wrenfield with designs upon the Duke entirely her own, and who had grown weary of watching the Ellery family's transparent maneuvering occupy attention she felt was rightfully hers. "How curious," Miss Delacourt remarked, loudly enough to carry across the drawing-room, the moment Serafina's performance concluded to polite applause, that the Ellery family arrives at Wrenfield so soon, after word reached town of Sir Anthony's rather considerable debts. One does wonder at the timing of such devoted attention to his grace. The room's polite chatter faltered into an uncomfortable hush. Mrs. Ellery's face drained of colour. Serafina, still seated at the pianoforte, looked as though she had been struck. "I am certain," Miss Delacourt continued, with the particular cruelty of someone enjoying herself, "that his grace would wish to know precisely what sort of household he is being courted by, before matters progress any further. I understand the younger Miss Ellery was discovered, only recently, handling a valuable item of his grace's that was never meant to leave the orangery at all." The insinuation landed with vicious precision, twisting Mina's honest return of the watch into something furtive and suspicious before a room full of watching eyes. Mina felt every gaze in the room shift toward her, felt the old familiar heat of humiliation rise up her throat, and understood with sick clarity that she was about to be made an example of before the very people whose good opinion her family depended upon. She had in that instant every reason to remain silent, to let the moment pass and hope it be forgotten by morning. She chose, instead, to stand. "I found his grace's pocket watch beneath a fern in the orangery," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, carrying clearly across the hushed room. I returned it directly to Mrs. Price within the hour, and asked nothing for its return, because it was never mine to keep, nor mine to bargain with. If Miss Delacourt wishes to imply otherwise, I would ask that she address her accusation to the housekeeper who received it from my own hands, rather than to a room full of witnesses who were not present to see the truth of it. A murmur moved through the assembled guests, not of scorn, as Miss Delacourt had clearly hoped, but of something closer to admiration for the quiet steadiness with which the accusation had been met. And then, from the far side of the room, came a voice that silenced every remaining whisper entirely. "Miss Delacourt speaks correctly on one point only," Julian said, rising from his chair with a calm that carried far more weight than any raised voice could have managed. "Miss Ellery did indeed handle an item of considerable value that was never meant to leave the orangery. What Miss Delacourt neglects to mention, because she does not know it, is that the watch in question was left there deliberately, by my own hand, as it has been left in various corners of this house for the past 3 years, in order to discover which of my guests might be trusted with something valuable when they believed no one was watching." He let the silence stretch a moment before continuing, his gaze steady upon Mina now, warm in a way that made her breath catch, despite everything. "In 3 years, Miss Ellery is the only guest of this house who has ever returned it without a single question of reward, recognition, or advantage. I would ask this room to consider very carefully whose character has truly been revealed here this evening, and whose has not." Miss Delacourt's face went a mottled, furious red, and she found, for perhaps the first time in her life, absolutely nothing to say. Mrs. Ellery stood frozen, torn between mortification at the public revelation of her family's debts and a dawning, disbelieving realization of precisely what the Duke's words might mean for her overlooked younger daughter. Serafina looked, for the first time in the whole of the house party, genuinely uncertain of her own place in the room, and Mina stood very still amid it all, feeling the weight of every eye upon her transform, for once in her life, from something to be endured into something almost unbearably like being seen. Julian crossed the room to her directly, before the whole assembly, and offered a bow that was, by every rule of the evening's etiquette, considerably deeper and more deliberate than the moment strictly required. "Miss Ellery," he said, quietly enough that it carried only to those nearest, though every eye in the room understood its meaning regardless, "I owe you a debt of gratitude I have not yet properly repaid, and an apology I hope you will one day permit me to make in full." He did not press her further that evening, and for that restraint Mina was quietly grateful, for her heart was too full of contradictory things, pride and humiliation, vindication and lingering hurt, to have managed a private conversation with any composure. But something had shifted irrevocably in the drawing-room that night, and every guest present understood it, whatever their private feelings on the matter. Mrs. Ellery, once the shock receded, proved rather more adaptable than either of her daughters might have predicted. By the following morning, she had already begun, with the same relentless energy she had previously directed toward Serafina's advancement, quietly redirecting her efforts toward Mina. A development Mina received with a complicated mixture of exasperation and weary, familiar recognition. "Mother," she said flatly, "over breakfast, I would ask that you not attempt to arrange anything on my behalf. I have had quite enough of being arranged. I only wish to see you settled happily, my dear," her mother protested, with a wounded innocence Mina no longer found remotely convincing. "You wished, until 3 days ago, to see Serafina settled happily as a duchess, and myself settled quietly out of the way," Mina replied, with more bluntness than she had ever permitted herself before, and found, to her own surprise, that it felt rather good to say it aloud at last. "I do not fault you entirely for it, but I will not be moved from one corner of your plans to another simply because the wind has changed direction. Whatever happens between His Grace and myself, it will happen because we choose it, not because you have calculated it." Her mother had no ready answer for that, and Serafina, seated across the table with an expression Mina could not entirely read, said nothing at all for a long moment before finally speaking, quietly, in a voice stripped of its usual practiced charm. "I did not know," she said, "that you wanted anything at all, Mina. I confess I never thought to ask." It was not quite an apology, but it was, Mina understood, the nearest thing to honesty her sister had likely ever offered her, and she found she had not the heart to refuse it. "I did not make it easy to ask," she admitted. "I learned, somewhere along the way, to want very little where it might be seen. It was safer that way." "Was," Serafina repeated, catching the tense. "Not any longer?" Mina did not answer that directly, though something in her expression must have spoken plainly enough, for Serafina's mouth curved, faintly, into something that might almost have been genuine warmth. "Well," she said, "I suppose I shall have to grow accustomed to sharing a little of the attention then for once." It was not a grand reconciliation, but it was, Mina thought, a beginning, and beginnings, she had learned this past fortnight, were worth a great deal more than she had once permitted herself to believe. The days that followed brought their own complications. For Sir Anthony Ellery's debts, the very matter Miss Delacourt had so cruelly exposed before the whole drawing-room, had not vanished simply because the family's reputation had, for once, emerged the better from public scrutiny. A letter arrived at Wrenfield midweek from Hartwell Cottage's solicitor. Its contents grim enough that Mina's mother took to her bed with a headache for the better part of a day, and Mina herself understood, reading between her father's careful, embarrassed phrasing, that matters had grown considerably worse than the family had previously admitted. There was, the letter indicated with painful delicacy, a gentleman of considerable means and considerably advanced years. A Mr. Josiah Renwick, a widower with estates in Cumberland, who had expressed interest in Mina's hand, and who was prepared to settle her father's most pressing debts as part of the arrangement. It was not, the solicitor's letter noted with careful understatement, an offer the family could easily afford to refuse. Mina read the letter alone in her chamber, feeling the old familiar weight of obligation settle over her shoulders like a well-worn coat, and understood, with a grief so sudden and complete it nearly stole her breath, that whatever had begun to bloom between herself and Julian these past weeks might be about to be sacrificed on the altar of her father's poor judgment, with cards and investments. Exactly as she had always privately feared her own future would be. She sat for a long while with the letter open upon her lap, staring at nothing, remembering with a bitterness that surprised her how many times in her life she had been told, gently or otherwise, that her wishes were a luxury the family could not presently afford. She had believed, these past weeks, that she had finally been permitted to want something freely, without calculation, without apology. Now here was the old arithmetic again, returned exactly when she had least expected it, reminding her that a woman without fortune was rarely permitted to keep what she had only just begun to love. She thought of Mr. Renwick, whom she had met only once, at a neighbour's dinner 2 winters past, a courteous enough man, she supposed, but one whose eyes had passed over her the entire evening with the flat, assessing look of a buyer inspecting livestock, and whose conversation had never once strayed from his own considerable holdings. To be given to such a man now, after everything, felt less like misfortune than like a particularly cruel joke at the expense of a heart that had only just learned to hope. She did not tell Julian immediately. She told herself this was prudence, a wish not to burden him with a matter not yet fully decided. In truth, some old, frightened part of her, the part that had learned, across a lifetime of small disappointments, never to expect rescue, feared that if she voiced the possibility of losing him aloud, it would somehow make the loss more certain. It was Fen, ever observant, who noticed the shadow that had fallen over her in the days that followed, and who, with the same blunt kindness he had once employed upon his employer, gently drew the truth from her during a chance meeting in the stable yard. "You ought to tell him, Miss Ellery," Fenn said quietly, once she had finished, her voice unsteady with the effort of holding back tears she refused, on principle, to shed before near strangers. "He is not a man who responds well to being protected from difficult truths. He has had rather too much of that already in his life." "I do not wish him to feel obligated," Mina said. "If he offers for me now, out of some sense of rescue, I could never be entirely certain, Miss Ellery," Fenn interrupted, not unkindly. "Forgive my presumption. But I have known his grace since we were boys together, and I have never in that time seen him look at another living soul the way he looks at you. Whatever he decides to do about Mr. Renwick's offer, I promise you it will have nothing whatsoever to do with obligation." She did tell him, that evening, in the library that had become, over these strange weeks, something like sacred ground between them. Julian listened in silence, his jaw tightening progressively as she spoke, until by the letter's conclusion something hard and decided had settled into his expression that she had not seen there before. "You will not marry Josiah Renwick," he said, when she had finished. "It is not entirely within my power to refuse, Your Grace. My father's debts are considerable, yes, and will be settled," Julian said, with the flat, immovable certainty of a man who had already resolved the matter in his own mind well before finishing the sentence. "Not through Renwick's charity, purchased at the cost of your entire future happiness, but through my own arrangement with your father, made openly and without condition upon your hand, so that no one, not your mother, not circumstance, not desperation, may ever again use your family's misfortune as leverage against your choices." Mina stared at him, scarcely daring to hope she had understood him correctly. "You would settle my father's debts and ask nothing in return?" "I would settle your father's debts because it is within my power to do so, and because I find I cannot in good conscience allow the woman I love to be bartered to a man 3 times her age, simply because her father lacked the sense to manage his own affairs," Julian said. And then, seeming to hear his own words fully for the first time, stopped and looked at her with an expression of such open, unguarded vulnerability that it took her breath entirely away. "I did not intend to say that quite so plainly," he admitted, "though I find, having said it, I do not regret it in the slightest. I love you, Mina Ellery. I have loved you, I think, since a housekeeper carried a watch into my study and told me you had asked for nothing in return for its return. I do not offer to settle your father's debts as a bargain for your hand. I offer it because your family's misfortune ought never again be used to force your choices, whatever those choices ultimately are. But I would be lying if I did not tell you that I hope, with everything I possess, that you will choose me freely, unburdened by debt or duty, or anyone's expectations but your own." The tears Mina had held back through her father's letter, through Miss Delacourt's cruelty, through a lifetime of small, careful disappointments, finally came, though these, at last, were not tears of grief. "I have spent so long," she said unsteadily, "training myself not to want things, because wanting them only made their absence harder to bear. I do not entirely know how to want something this large and trust that it will not be taken from me." "Then let us learn together," Julian said quietly, closing the distance between them at last. "I am somewhat out of practice myself, in matters of trust, but I find I would rather risk being wrong about you than spend one more year certain I am safe, and entirely alone." He did not press for an answer that night, understanding. With the same patient care that had marked every honest moment between them, that some things could not be rushed toward their proper conclusion, however much his own heart, unruly and unguarded now in a way it had not been for years, longed to hear her answer at once. But when Mina finally did answer him, 3 days later, in the same orangery where a lost watch had first set this whole improbable chain of events into motion, she did so not with hesitation, but with the quiet, hard-won certainty of a woman who had finally, after a lifetime of expecting little, allowed herself to want everything. "I choose you," she said simply, freely, and for no reason but that you are the first person who has ever looked at me and seen something worth choosing. Julian took her hands then, the very hands that had once closed honestly around a stranger's lost watch, rather than pocket its worth, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that felt, to Mina, like the closing of some long, quiet grief, and the opening of something entirely new. The remainder of the house party unfolded with considerably less drama than its earlier days had promised, though not without its final small satisfactions. Mr. Josiah Renwick, upon learning that Sir Anthony's debts had already been settled through arrangement with the Duke of Wrenfield, withdrew his offer with a swiftness that confirmed precisely how little regard he had held for Mina beyond her family's desperation. Miss Delacourt departed Wrenfield a full week before the party's official conclusion, her ambitions thoroughly and publicly disappointed, and was not, by any account, greatly missed. Seraphina, to everyone's quiet surprise including her own, found herself drawn during those final days into genuine conversation with Mr. Fenn, whose dry humour and steady competence proved, upon closer acquaintance, rather more appealing to her than she might once have admitted. Accustomed as she was to measuring gentlemen chiefly by title and fortune, whether that particular acquaintance would ripen into something lasting remained. For now, a story yet unwritten. But it was, Mina thought, watching her sister laugh genuinely for what seemed the first time in years, a hopeful beginning all the same, and one she found herself, quite unexpectedly, rooting for with her whole heart. Mrs. Ellery, for her part, learned to speak of her younger daughter's engagement to a duke with such enthusiastic, retroactive pride that one might have believed, hearing her recount the tale to their neighbours upon returning to Hartwell Cottage, that she had orchestrated the entire romance from its very first moment. Mina found she had not the heart to correct the account too thoroughly. Some victories were sweeter simply left to speak for themselves. The wedding, when it came the following spring, was held in the small stone chapel at Wrenfield, filled with early violets and the pale gold light of an English April morning. Word of the match had travelled well beyond the county by then, carried by servants and neighbours and the sort of gossip that delights in a story too fitting to leave unpolished. And more than one guest arriving that morning admitted, quietly and without shame, that they had come chiefly to see for themselves whether the tale of the overlooked sister and the Duke's lost watch could possibly be as true as it was told. It was, they found, truer than any account had managed to capture, for no retelling could quite convey the particular quiet joy on the Duke's face as he watched his bride walk the short aisle toward him, nor the steadiness in her own step, a woman who had spent a lifetime making herself small now walking, at last, exactly as tall as she pleased. Mina wore, at her own quiet insistence, a gown of simple ivory rather than the elaborate finery her mother had initially proposed, and found, standing at the altar in the plain dress she had chosen for herself, that she had never in her life felt more entirely, unmistakably seen. Julian met her at the altar with an expression that needed no further words of explanation, though he offered one small gesture that drew a soft, unexpected sound of emotion from more than one guest in the chapel. He reached into his coat and drew out his mother's watch, now newly engraved beneath its original inscription, and pressed it gently into Mina's hands before the ceremony began. To measure what matters, not merely what passes, the old inscription still read. Beneath it, in fresh, careful lettering, he had added a second line. Found, at last, in her. Mina held the watch through the whole of the ceremony that followed. Its familiar weight settled warm against her palm, and thought of a quiet morning in the orangery, when she had knelt to retrieve a lost, ordinary-seeming object and chosen, without a single witness to reward her for it. to do the honest thing simply because it was the right one. She had not known then that the entire course of her life balanced upon that small, unwitnessed choice. She knew it now, standing before the man who had loved her not for her beauty, nor her name, nor anything she had ever performed to be seen, but for the quiet, unremarkable truth of who she was when she believed no one was watching at all. It was, she thought, exactly the sort of ending her old, cautious heart would once have told her never to hope for. She was profoundly, joyfully glad she had chosen, at last, to hope for it anyway. Outside the chapel, the bells of Wrenfield rang out across the spring morning, carrying the news of the wedding to every corner of the estate, and somewhere in the great house behind them, in a study that had once held nothing but ledgers and grief, a new portrait was already being commissioned, of a duke and his duchess, and between them, held carefully in her hands, a small gold watch that had once measured character, and now measured only the steady, unhurried passage of a happiness neither of them had ever quite dared to expect. The servants of Wrenfield would tell the story for years afterward, embellishing it a little more with each retelling, until the tale of the plain sister and the lost pocket watch had become something of a legend below stairs. Proof, as Mrs. Price liked to say with quiet satisfaction whenever a new servant asked after the origin of the strange little watch kept always upon the Duchess's writing desk. That character revealed in solitude was worth infinitely more than beauty performed in company, and that the truest kind of love, when it finally arrived, always seemed to know exactly where to look. And in the years that followed, whenever a small, ordinary object went missing somewhere about the vast rambling halls of Wrenfield, a glove, a letter, a ring left carelessly upon a table, it was the Duchess herself, more often than not, who quietly ensured it found its way back to its proper owner, without ever once pausing to ask what reward such honesty might bring her. She had learned, long ago, that it never needed to bring her anything at all. The doing of the right thing, quietly when no one was watching, had already brought her everything she had ever truly wanted. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the great house had settled into its familiar hush, and the last of the household candles had been carried away, Julian would find his wife in the orangery, standing near the very fern beneath which she had once knelt to retrieve a stranger's lost watch, and he would come to stand beside her without a word, content simply to share the silence that had first brought them, however improbably, into one another's lives. She never tired of that small green corner of the house, though she could never quite explain to him why, beyond the simple truth that it had taught her something she might otherwise never have learned in a lifetime of being overlooked. That character, real character, was rarely announced or rewarded in the moment it was chosen. It was only ever recognized afterward, quietly, by someone patient enough to have been watching all along. She thought, too, in those still evenings, of the girl she had been at Hartwell Cottage, standing before a cold mirror, promising herself she would not weep over what was never truly hers to lose. That girl had not known, could not have known, that an ordinary morning and an ordinary act of honesty would one day undo the whole quiet architecture of a life built around expecting little. She found, looking back, that she did not resent that girl her caution. She had needed it once, the way a traveler needs a coat against a long winter. But she was glad, more than she could ever fully put into words, that she had finally been given a spring worth shedding it for. And when, some years later, a daughter was born to the Duke and Duchess of Wrenfield, a dark-haired, solemn-eyed girl who took, from her earliest days, an inexplicable delight in turning over small found objects in her palm as though weighing their secrets, Mina told her, long before the child was old enough to fully understand it, the story of a lost pocket watch and a plain, overlooked young woman who had chosen honesty in an empty orangery, never once imagining that anyone at all was watching. She told her that the choosing was the whole of it, that reward, recognition, even love itself, were never the reasons to do the right thing. Only, if one was fortunate enough, its unexpected and undeserved companions. The little watch itself, its case now doubly engraved, was kept always upon the Duchess's writing desk, ticking quietly through the long, unhurried years of a marriage, built upon nothing grander than the simple, radical act of being honest when no one was looking, and finding, at last, that someone had been looking all along.